Thank you. Thank you for joining us today for ACRL RBMS's Security Committee sponsored webinar, An Introduction to Cybersecurity. My name is Beth Kilmarks of Texas A&M University Libraries, and I will be your Zoom host. Our presenter, Christopher Lanclos, will get started shortly. If you have a question, please type your question into the chat box, and we will do a question and answer time after the presentation. Please be aware that this presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing after the presentation. Now I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Christopher Lanclos. He serves as a Senior Research Engineer 2 in the Cybersecurity Center at Texas A&M University. His expertise spans various domains within cybersecurity, including malware analysis, machine learning, network security, and digital forensics. As a dedicated educator, he has mentored and taught numerous undergraduate students. Dr. Lanclos's research focuses on protecting the nation's cyberspace, including our critical infrastructure. He is also interested in increasing the number of minorities obtaining STEM degrees. And now I will turn to Dr. Lanclos for him to start his presentation.
Thank you, Beth. Let's get things started. All right. So let's get started. All right. So we are under attack. That is the reality. We face attacks to our organizations, to ourselves, to our infrastructure every day. Some of the attacks that you guys might be more familiar with is last year's 2023, the British Library ransomware attack, and which they stole over 600 gigabytes of files. Some of that information was personal information about the staff and the library users, and all that information was actually sold on the dark web, put up. And also you have the Seattle Public Library, very a more recent attack. And what's such a devastating part about this attack is their systems are still currently down. This attack happened at the end of May, and a lot of their systems are still have not been recovered. And it's not just libraries, right? Hospitals are being attacked by ransomware. There are different types of attacks that are occurring, and we as people that are working for these institutions, that are citizens that are using our cyberspace, we need to be vigilant and understand the attacks that we are facing at this time. So who are our adversaries, right? First, we have our hacktivists, we have our state-sponsored hackers, we have cyber terrorists, we have general hackers, we have our insiders, we have cybercrime organizations, and we have script kiddies. And all of these different adversaries have different types of motivations, right? Some of them are there for financial gain. Some are focused on political and ideological beliefs. Some focus on espionage. Some is just the challenge, the notoriety in the hacking community that they want. If you're dealing with an insider threat, personal grudges and revenge is a common motivator. And then you have social and ethical motivations. This is sometimes hacktivists where they intervene in situations where they believe that there's a social wrong that is occurring. And then you have nationalism, where there are a pride in the country that you are a part of, and that motivates you to be willing to attack other nations, essentially. So these are essentially the motivations that we have to deal with and we have to understand. And this essentially gives us an idea of who is attacking us, who is, in a lack of terms, who are our enemies. And so one quote I want us to really focus on is this: companies spend millions of dollars on firewalls, encryption, and secure access devices, and it's money wasted. None of these measures address the weakest link in the security chain. And that weakest link, we are the weakest link in the chain. people are the weakest link in the chain. And we can actually see this in the events that occurred in 2024, the CrowdStrike incident that happened this weekend, right? People are the ones that were responsible for pushing out that update. People were responsible for evaluating and reviewing the update. And this one mistake that was fixable within hours has still shut down some computers, because some of the updates have to be manually processed on the user's end. And so there are still computers that have not been updated, but it's cost the our cyberspace $10 billion. And it is important to really understand that we are the weakest link as the users of these systems, as the programmers of these systems, and as the policymakers of these systems. We have to make sure and understand that we it is imperative that we're looking at ourselves and that everybody is a part of the solution in cybersecurity. But there's good news, right? It's not all bad, right? We can be stronger. We can be a stronger piece of the chain, right? Um, and I love this quote: cybersecurity is much more than a matter of IT. When we think about cybersecurity, especially non-technical people, we think about it in a way where this is not our problem, right? Well, we need the administrators to come in. We need IT to come in and fix this. This is their problem. It is something that is not my responsibility. But that's not true. If we're using the system, if we're using our cyberspace, we are responsible for it. And we are the front line. We are the individuals that can actually notice an issue before IT might notice it, right? So what I want us to do is actually go over some steps that are actually prepare us um, for this task, prepare us for actually being a professional that is interested in protecting our cyberspace. So I have a couple of steps, or a few steps, should I say, that is imperative, right? The first is continuous education. Talks like these, where it drives home the importance of different attacks, or the importance of cybersecurity, where you are increasing your knowledge, is imperative, right? So training, going through different scenarios, experiencing different possibilities, case studies, right? Getting familiar with actual attacks that are occurring on these systems, right? And in your network. The next step is implementing best practices and strong policies, right? So there are best practices that are out there in how we set up our devices, how we set up our communication networks, how we set up our network. All of these, there's best practices. And at some level, there's the responsibility of the IT professionals to be in charge of that. But there's actually some things that non-IT professionals can actually do, right? Ensuring that routine data backups are that are occurring, right? Data is king. When we think about our information age, data is king. We're thinking about big data. How can we process? How we can gather more, right? And most of the money that's being made from a criminal perspective is actually the selling of data, the selling of our personal data. So yeah, you have routine data backups. That means if you're having your databases or you're having your personal computers, not only can you have a backup on that computer, but you have external backups as well. So you want to make sure those are implemented. And if they're not implemented, you don't have a policy or procedure in doing that, and then you need to advocate for these, because backups are, in general, a very cheap solution to different attacks and different incidences. Regular updates and patch management. So although the CrowdStrike situation was caused by essentially an update, right? It is important that we're actually updating our system and keeping them patched, because those updates and patches usually are to fix other bugs and other vulnerabilities that are actually on the system. So it's imperative that that is happening. And so all the messages that we get on our computer saying, hey, it's time for this this update, this software needs to be updated. It is our responsibility to make sure that we are not ignoring those, right? Although we might not be able to run the backup ourselves, we need to make sure that we are contacting people and notifying them that it is time to actually have that backup and have those patches. A lot of these things, like the backups and the patching, these are automated processes that can be implemented, right? Now, what's unique about libraries in general is that you have a lot of endpoints. Essentially, you have a lot of devices that are open to the public, right? And this is a great service that is available to all the communities that can participate in it. Unfortunately, that is a huge area of attack, right? You're essentially allowing strangers to come onto your network and use the devices as they see fit. And so it's important to deploy endpoint protection. The endpoint protection meaning protection on specific devices, right? And what's nice about endpoint protection is usually they're pretty cheap, right? Like in the big scheme of things of hiring cybersecurity professionals and deploying network related defenses, endpoint protection is fairly cheap usually. So an antivirus software, making sure that you have one on all the devices that are on your network, making sure that you have firewalls in place, right? It is a very common thing to have public unprotected library Wi-Fi, for example, right? Some of those things might need to be changed, right? You might need to have a split network where you have your core services on one network that is protected and your Wi-Fi unprotected if you want to keep those services. Implementing intrusion detection system as well. And so there's this idea in cybersecurity called layering. So we want to layer our defense. So one layer after another, because everything has a vulnerability. This is a common idea that cybersecurity professionals repeat over and over again, that everything that is connected to the internet that is turned on has a vulnerability. The only safe computer is one that's not turned on, right? And so you also want to be interested in access control, right? So ensuring that you implement least privilege access. If you are giving access to your computers or access to your network, you want to ensure that, hey, not only are the users, right, our customers having the least privilege and they cannot update our system or make new accounts and have a lot of the ability to change and update software and things like that. You want to provide least privilege not only for the user, but also the staff as well. You should have dedicated staff that is responsible for those things, like updating your system, ensuring backups. But it should not be a step up a all staff members have that access. In addition, you want to ensure that that access is what we call non-repudiation. It's usually used in networking term, but this idea that you can prove who actually implemented or gained access to a specific software, right? Or a specific count. So you essentially you don't want to share accounts. So say you had a administrative account where you actually implement all the updates. Well, you want to ensure that that account is not shared by multiple staff, because then you don't really know who is responsible for updates or who is responsible for a lack of backups or any of the security measures that are put in place. Okay. You want to have strong policies clearly for passwords, If possible, you want to implement multi-factor authentication. That's another automated measure that can be put in place as well. And lastly, when it comes to implementing best practices and strong policies, you want to establish policies and protocols on how you handle sensitive information. When a customer calls the library and they're asking about information, what is your policy to deal with it? If a a child comes and is requesting information about their parent's account at the library, what is your policy in dealing with that? And so it is very important that these policies and their protocols are actually put in place, but also that there are consistent reminders and practice sessions essentially in actually dealing with these types of attacks, right? So it's important that we have those things. Now, deploying an incident response plan is our next step. Uh, it is, we have another common saying in cybersecurity. It is not if you're going to be attacked, it is when you're going to be attacked. Essentially, eventually, we're going to have an incident response. So you need to have a plan, right? If you don't have a plan, this is something that you can advocate for and you can work on. And it doesn't have to be an official plan done by a cybersecurity professional. If you are running a library, you can implement your own process based off the knowledge that you have, right? And so SANS, which is a cybersecurity training institute, essentially provides a very high level of training for different cybersecurity professionals. But they've come up with the steps in an incident response. So having a plan for each one of these steps is imperative, right? Preparation, right? So this is a pre-incident. So what are you going to do to prepare for an incident? How are you going to put certain things in place? Who do we have a document that lists all our contact information, our contacts in case of a incident? Is it printed out just in case that our systems are not available, right? Identification. This is actually identifying that there is an issue. Oh, okay, well, for some reason, there is a ransomware on this random computer that I just booted up. That's a identification, right? What is that person's responsibility? Who do they contact? What is their process? And the case studies that during training should help you be able to identify possible attacks and possible probing of one system. The next thing is containment, right? Sometimes you're able to actually do some containment. For example, turning off systems that have not currently been affected is a common um, measure that is put in place to protect the rest of the systems. So if you see one computer on your network being affected, then it's more than likely that the other ones could possibly be affected as well. So we turning those off to ensure that the attack is not propagated through the system. Now, eradication is usually not our process. Usually we bring in a specialist if your organization doesn't have a dedicated IT person. Usually this brings in a third party person to help with this. And then you have which helps with the eradication and the recovery process. And then there's lessons learned, right? There is a way that attacker, that adversary actually got into our system. So let's see how that actually occurred, right? And learn from that process. The next step for us is to think like the adversary, right? So we talked about their motivations and we talked about the possible adversaries that we could have. And they all kind of go through the same process, right? And this is what we call the 5 phases of hacking, right? The reconnaissance, scanning, infiltration, maintaining access, and covering tracks. Now, by us knowing these things, it's going to help us understand how our actions, when we're going through our training, when we're implementing certain certain preventative measures, how it's going to protect from these. So reconnaissance, essentially serving for evidence and information on the target individual or group, right? This is identifying if somebody is actually targeting your organization, right? Or you specifically. A lot of attacks actually target specific groups of people within organizations because of psychological um essentially mappings to those individuals, right? Like sales people are more likely to think very similar. So there might be a specific attack for salespeople, right? There are the C-suite. There might be specific attacks for C-suite. So this is a surveying evidence in relating to that. Now you have scanning. Now scanning, this is usually a technical piece where they are scanning the network, they're scanning specific devices, they're essentially creating a map of your systems. And so what prevents them from doing that, right? Are those firewalls that we talked about earlier? That's a preventative. The reconnaissance also, firewalls also help with preventing reconnaissance training, right? We have very important people in our organization. Are they sharing information online on their social media that can be um, detrimental to the organization? These are all pieces of the reconnaissance and scanning portion, right? And then you have the actual infiltration. This is the actual exploitation. This is the ransomware being run on the computers, right? And sometimes one infiltration is actually a cover up for another. So what a common thing is for ransomware is actually using a ransomware to distract from another attack, because ransomware is so easily propagated through a system, and it's so disruptive, and it's actually pretty easy to implement. They're usually used to give time to the attackers to actually get other pieces or to execute a different type of attack or to gain access to other pieces of data, right? So that infiltration, they're interested in infiltrating. And next, they're interested in maintaining access, right? Uh, as hackers, we want to stay inside of the system as long as possible, right? And the longer we can stay in there, the longer the more we have time to understand the system, to understand its weaknesses, to look up some of the weaknesses, and to exploit those weaknesses. And we want to cover everything up, right? We want to delete logs. We want to trace. We want the hacker, should I say, want to um, essentially get rid of any evidence showing that we are in the system. And this can be done in a variety of ways. We can set out minor attacks. We can delete logs and delete registries and a whole bunch of things, essentially showing or even falsify these things and showing that what actually occurred on a computer didn't actually occur, right? So these essentially are the five phases of hacking. And there's a lot of tools that are used, right? And there's a lot of different attacks that hackers can exploit, right? You have your phishing attacks, but there's a variety of different types of phishing attacks. The most common are email, right? All of us probably get phishing attacks on a daily basis because of how easy they are to actually implement. This is why your junk folder is always full, right? Um, um, Email providers have done pretty good job of blocking most of these attacks. Um, and so you have your malware, which ransomware is considered a part of. You have your man in the middle of attack. You have this is a networking type of attack. You have your denial of service attack. This is actually executed in a variety of different ways, but essentially preventing your customers from gaining access, right? So ransomware is a form of a denial of service attack. If I can shut down a system and put it up for ransom, as long as that system is unavailable, that is a denial of service attack. Uh, if your service brings in revenue, then you're losing revenue, right? Excuse me. You have your SQL injections. This is specifically for databases. So if you have a database, which I'm assuming all libraries have databases, they probably are using SQL, and those SQL databases, you can actually we can write script in a way that you can inject it into its normal functioning process and actually get data. Oops, get data from. You have cross-site scripting, password attacks. This is like brute forcing. You have your insider threats, right? It's interesting. Libraries are very interesting because you inherently have insider threats because you're inviting the public in. You're inviting the public in to your network in a way. And then you have zero-day exploits as well. Um, so yeah, sorry. Um, but another thing we need to think about when we're thinking about we're trying to think like an adversary is not only the types of attacks, but how they're getting in. For us, this is actually probably more important, right? For individuals that are not on the IT side, even on the IT side, because sometimes they're easy to their confidence is exploitable, essentially. Um, you have different infection vectors. So this is ways that attacks can get on the system, okay? Removable media. So you're inviting the public to come in and print something out on your computers. Well, they're using jump drives. They're bringing different media storage devices onto your system, right? That's an attack vector. Social engineering. We're going to go a little bit deeper into that because I think this is very important for um, libraries in general, but everybody, because this is a type of attack that requires no technical experience at all, right? And is easily exploited by people that are just willing to talk to people. You have email attachments. If you have a email that's coming from somebody, you're not expecting it, but the email seems very legit. You click on an email attachment and they could gain access to your data, right? They can install a type of malware. You have phishing links, right? This could be inside of an email, but there's also different types of phishing. It's called phishing that can be done actually over the phone, right? Um, you have compromised websites. Again, you're inviting people to come into your network, and you don't know. You have um, little control of what they're searching for, so they can actually seek out websites that have been compromised and that allow for drive-by downloads, where they visit the website and something is automatically downloaded to your system. You have software vulnerabilities. If you're not keeping up with those, with the updates and the patches that need to be made on your system, then your software is vulnerable because usually those patches are because there's some type of vulnerability or some type of bug that can be exploited. You have a malicious advertisement, right? This goes back to going to websites and looking at clicking on different advertisements that are there. Uh, there's very little control um, that the user that librarians and people that work at libraries have over the users doing this, right? So I did want to specifically point out social engineering, right? And this is the human factor. This is essentially a type of malicious behavior that uh, is based on human interactions, just conversations, right? And these conversations can happen over email. They can happen actually over the phone. These are very common. And the idea is to provide some pretext, right? A fabricated scenario to get this. That is one execution. Sometimes it's just asking questions. If you're a very social person, right, or you run into somebody that seems very sociable, the amount of information that we can give out that might be pertaining to, for example, our passwords, right? It's very common that we use important dates in our passwords. It's very common that we use names or of like high schools or children or dogs or pets of any kind, right? We use familiar things within our passwords, right? But we never think about how easily we share that information, right? A dog lover loves talking about their dog, right? They can tell you the year that they got their dog. They'll tell you what breed they are. They'll tell you the name, right? And all that information will be collected and used to do a brute force attack on a person's password, right? There's baiting, essentially providing a false promise. There's a quid pro quo, and there's tailgating. Tailgating is more of a physical in nature. So, for example, some of your libraries have um, spaces where there's authorized users only, right? Maybe there's specific access that you need to go access certain books or certain documents. Then tailgating is this essentially this act of following a authorized personnel, and they essentially act like they're supposed to be there, right? Like they're essentially pretending. And social engineering, the tools of the trade are authority. So they're acting as though they have authority in these situations. So if you're getting a phone call and somebody's pretending to be the director of so and so, right? And usually they use like third party services. So for example, a library said, hey, we do bring in a third party to do security. Well, I wouldn't pretend like I'm part of the library. I would pretend like I'm part of the third party. I would pretend like I'm the company that's being hired for security, and I'll get you to let me in, right? uh by pretending that I have authority in a different way, right? Urgency is a huge thing, right? So some of the I would not be surprised if a lot of hackers took advantage of the CrowdStrike incident and had people use that as an urgency. Oh, my system's down, what do I need to do? And you're essentially contacting somebody that doesn't really that you're not supposed to be contacting, but they're using that sense of urgency to get information out from you, to give you access that they shouldn't have, right? The scarcity as well, like this is limited time. Fear is also a big component, and then using your helpfulness, right? I don't know if you guys have heard about this big conference called DEF CON. It's a hacking conference that is in Las Vegas every year in August. And essentially, they have social engineering competitions. And one of the most common things is trying to appeal to somebody's desire to be helpful, right? We all tend to, for the most part, most people tend to be desire to be helpful. And because of that, that is exploitable, right? If you're getting a call and you hear this baby crying, but it's not really a baby, it's a recording of a baby, right? Like I go to YouTube and start like play this video about this baby crying. The A woman is weeping on the phone. They're telling you the story about their husband has just died, right? Like all these things, and there's this desire to be helpful, so you break a rule, right? There's this policy in place that I don't share this piece of information, but because the story, because the situation is so appealing and you want to be helpful, you actually give up information that isn't. This is a common tactic that is used. uh Reciprocity, right? And social proof, saying somebody you're not the somebody else did it, right? Like, hey, not only Chris did it, but Beth did it too, right? These are all social and this is why we call it social engineering, right? These are all social cues that that are used to actually trick people that into providing information that would essentially give us the same access without the technical expertise that is needed. The next step, so we had the 5 steps, right? Step 4 was thinking like an adversary. Step 5 is advocating for cybersecurity, right? We You're probably in a position where it's not your responsibility to make the last like to make the decision if we're going to invest for cybersecurity, but you're probably in a position where you can advocate for cybersecurity. You can encourage increased defensive measures to be put in place, right? Increased training for the staff. And that is imperative and important that is actually being done, right? You want to advocate for cybersecurity in the position that you're in. And the next step is the final step, right? It is refine and repeat. You want to refine and repeat all of these steps. You want to get more, you want to do more training, right? You want to think more and more like an adversary. You want to implement the best practices and policies, right? You want to develop an incident response plan. And you want to advocate for cybersecurity. The better that you get at this process, the more refined and the more that you repeat this process, the better it's going to be, and the safer that your organization and the safer that you are going to be. So I just wanted to leave you with this. Remember, security is a process. It's not a product. There's no silver bullet. You're not going to be able to buy this one product and get a guarantee that now your system is secure. This is an ongoing thing that you're going to have to learn about. You're going to have to understand. And you don't have to know the technical pieces and the technical aspects, but the high level is enough for most day-to-day processes. And remembering that the better that you are, the stronger the chain is together. So, any questions?
Okay, Chris, I have one in the chat, and it says our new library catalog system requires people to sign into it to use it. Do you think that this is likely to become the standard from a cybersecurity perspective?
Um, Probably. I think that although it probably affects the user experience because that's additional step that has to be taken, right? And so it essentially it is cumbersome. And when we think about cybersecurity, we really think about 3 things. We think about confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? And essentially, when you're implementing cybersecurity uh, efforts, sometimes or most of the time, the availability of the service is actually affected, right? And so there's essentially it could be less availability or difficult to get it. So yes, it probably is because it does a couple of things, right? It allows us to track when certain things are actually occurring. So you have somebody that's physically at one of your computers, for example, and they're looking up a book, right? Well, there's now a record of that uh in the system, right? And now we know at least what account it is tied to. It might not be that person's account, but we have data about when, where it occurred, and possibly who is it connected to.
Okay. We are open. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I'm interested with the British Library cyber attack.
Mhm.
What is taking so long to bring up the services that have been taken down, such as it's the English, the short title catalog is still down. And do you have any insight on that?
So part of the issue is um if there wasn't a backup for those systems, you can't just bring them back online. And so you essentially have to rebuild them. And so sometimes you might have a system that, especially there's you don't ever pay a ransom. Like it's kind of like known that you don't pay the ransom because most of the hackers don't actually release your system or release your data, right? And so this even goes for hospitals, right? There's been many of cases that hospitals paid the ransom so because was so urgent for their patients, and the hackers just didn't do anything, right? Like they never actually gave access back to the thing, and so they essentially got free money. So anyways, I digress. The the system wasn't essentially backed up enough, right? And so they didn't have a plan to, if this system is attacked or shut down, we didn't have a backup that we can bring up. So they're essentially probably rebuilding that whole system back. And so that includes like the data entry. So getting each of the pieces of what's actually available at that library, and actually putting it back into the system. So, and that's a costly thing, right? Like that's an additional cost off just the cost of running a library. And unfortunately, libraries are traditionally not funded well, right? And so that means that their budget is pretty tight. And so somebody might be assigned to do that that also has another job to do. And so unless there's funding or donations to maybe have that support, uh, organizations that have lack of funds are usually hurt the most by these types of attacks.
All right, thank you. Let's see. Here's another question. Does using the Z39.50 protocol for information exchange make your library more vulnerable to attacks?
I am not sure. I've never heard of that protocol, so I can look it up real quick. That's interesting. It is a specific library related protocol? Oh, okay, okay. Um, I know. Okay, okay. So there are some built-in pieces that make communication in that protocol more secure. So this goes into networking, but essentially there are multiple protocols that kind of define how communication is done between computers on the internet. And so um, this protocol encompasses multiple protocols that essentially have security pieces built into it to prevent certain types of attacks, right? And so essentially there's layers of protocols within this one protocol. So yes, it can help with that, and from a confidentiality and usually an integrity perspective. So as information is being passed, it's encrypted in such a way that it the if there's somebody in the middle trying to listen in or watch the packets being sent from computer to computer, um they can't read the file. And then there's there's also protocols to ensure that that file is coming from the person that it's supposed to be coming from, and or the device that it's supposed to be coming from. So in short, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Oh,
Um,
or I mean, in short, no. I guess you
yeah,
were asking the negative. So no.
yes. All right, well, thank you very much. Are there any more questions? I've been hearing discussions with some librarians of, oh, here's one. Can you speak on how artificial intelligence can make my cyber presence more vulnerable? How do you see AI being used to protect devices at the library or maybe even my phone?
Yeah. So uh, art that is a long, this is going to be a somewhat of a long answer. So artificial intelligence, one, um it makes you more vulnerable, usually because you're sharing information, either involuntarily or voluntarily.
Mm.
So, for example, ChatGPT, as you engage with ChatGPT, you're sharing information. So as you ask you a question, they can make a profile of you based off the questions you ask, based off the information you implement, right? So, for example, if you're using it in a work context and you're uploading documents to analyze for you, well, ChatGPT now has that document, right? So, what type of document did you share? So there's that type of vulnerability, and ChatGPT has no responsibility. So you can't sue ChatGPT for voluntarily giving it information, right? So that is a type of vulnerability that is out there. Also, the bias, right? So we think about artificial intelligence as these machines, but all of them are programmed in a way to have bias in them, right? So um, it's kind of uh, they try not to, right? Like there's some level in they try not to put biases in certain places, but if there's any social norms or political ideologies, right, that are in there, then that artificial intelligent software is working with that bias, right? Because we're not at a place with artificial intelligence where artificial intelligence is learning by like is not following our directions, right? Like we essentially still label if this is good information, this is bad information. We're still like teaching it if is this a right answer or is this a wrong answer, right? Like we're there's some level we still have a lot of control over it. And so there that's another form from a um from a more technical on a device. Yes, there are vulnerabilities because now it's a third party software that you're integrating into your system, right? And so now you have to make sure that's updated. You have to make sure that um, is your system able to deal with some of the data extraction that is being occurring? Is it allowing it? Is it not allowing it? When you guys download an app and the first time you open it on, especially in iOS devices, there's this question, excuse me, that you're asked like, hey, do you want to share your data or don't share my data? Like there's this yes or no question or asking the app not to do it, right? Like that's that type of block that is your computer able to actually put in place. Second part of the question, how do you see AI being used for tech devices at the library? So I mentioned like intrusion detection systems and antivirus software and firewalls. Those are probably going to be right now they're very signature based, meaning that they've seen attack before, uh, and the software has been updated, so when they see the attack again, they're able to block it, right? Where now AI is going to be able to use the patterns of previously seen attacks to actually identify new attacks that have not been seen. So and same thing on your phone. So all of this, although all of this is uh uniform to all devices, right? So some devices are a little bit more secure than others, right? Like Apple devices tend when you downloading as an actual Apple app, they tend to be a little bit safer than like Google Play because those apps go through a review process before they can go on the Apple Store. So Apple actually reviews some of that, but it doesn't mean like your data is not being, still extracted or anything like that. It just might mean you have less malware or hidden features inside of it.
Okay, thank you. And
Mhm.
I have another question here. I used to work at a public library where every time the computers were logged off, there was a program that wiped any new settings, downloads, etc. Is that data still stored somewhere?
Probably not. And so it's a common method for public labs or public networks that have have their devices kind of do this. Um, the only thing that probably is stored is like who logged in. So if your computer's required a specific login for your users to use, then that was probably stored off-site. Um, but besides that, probably not.
Okay, great. Next question. Our institutional repository suffers from bots crawling, which slows down or crashes the site frequently. Maybe this is a form of DDoS attack.
It is.
It is. Suggestions for preventing or reducing DDoS attacks, unlimited budget slash staff.
Yeah. So this is really a technical either be technical intervention that needs to be put in place, but essentially what I assume, this is just an assumption, so don't take it like as gospel. What I assume is currently happening is you're probably getting flooded. So bots, multiple bots are attacking the system at one time and just asking information over and over again. And so what is you essentially are the system is getting flooded, so it doesn't allow for actual communication to occur, the real communication to occur. And so um you would essentially need somebody in IT to say, hey, they need to block the IP addresses or the ports that this attack is coming from or targeting. And it's actually for somebody to know what they're doing. It's not a hard fix. It's not difficult to fix. It just needs somebody to actually do that.
Okay. And both, everyone has said thank you to your responses. And I will wait another few seconds or so to see if any other additional questions are coming in. But it's interesting. Oh, here we go. Perhaps a comment. We had a similar issue with our DL/IR and our IT blocked the IP ranges they were coming from and identified many were coming from Hong Kong.
Yeah,
Is there, so I guess my question, I guess it leads to is, are these attacks coming from specific countries? And what are they specifically, or who are they specifically targeting?
I cannot speak for those specific attacks. So it's very yeah. So this is it's going to be a weird answer. Probably, but probably not. So it is very common to say, hey, an attack is coming from a certain place, and it actually is not coming from that place, right? So it could be using IP addresses that seem to be coming from Hong Kong, and it probably wasn't actually coming from Hong Kong. And I say probably as well because unfortunately, uh, China is one of our adversaries as the United States. And so China attacks us a lot in our cyberspace. So it could possibly have been them. But usually they would have tried to hide it a little bit more, um, where it'd have been more difficult to say it actually came from Hong Kong. You can use different techniques um, networking techniques to kind of hide location initially of where certain attacks are coming from.
Okay, thank you. Another question. In academia, we heavily use SSO for access to systems. How secure is this? And are there vulnerabilities other than human we should be aware of?
Yeah, so it's pretty secure. It's essentially our current standard right now. So and the reason why is to defeat it, the computational load is too heavy. So it essentially we think about when we think about how difficult certain things are to exploit, we think about it from like a brute force perspective. So how hard it would be to brute force it. And so our current SOS methods is essentially pretty hard to brute force, right? So attackers look for other ways to exploit that, right? So um, now when it comes to um, vulnerabilities, there are tons of vulnerabilities. In fact, a lot of your systems probably have known vulnerabilities that the companies that have created softwares or created the different systems haven't actually dealt with, but they actually report it to a site. So there's this in the US, there's other sites in other countries as well. But in the US, we have a site where you can actually look up vulnerabilities for different software, and down to the version of that type of software. And so I will say this: companies don't usually publicize all their vulnerabilities, right? Like, so they might share that there are vulnerabilities, but these are probably ones that have been taken care of, one, or that they're so minute and there's no possibility of really doing anything with, that they're comfortable with sharing.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And this also leads to another discussion. Will companies ever admit that they've been cyber attacked?
Yeah, so some will, some will, some so it's a yes and no, right? Like, so the I actually taught a camp to like um some middle school and high schoolers, and we taught to kind of talk about ethics in cybersecurity. And this is essentially an ethics question. It's like, you would think the correct answer is yes, I would, like, you should report it, right? But then it's like, okay, well, let's think about CrowdStrike situation. Their stock probably dipped during this, right? Their stock probably was sold. Somebody sold their stock and their stock went down, right? So the company not only has the responsibility for their customer, but they also have a responsibility to their stakeholders. And so is it um is it okay uh to share something that might affect your shareholders but be beneficial to your customers, right? Like, so there's this ethics of shareholders versus customers or things like that. So uh for the most part, if there's serious attacks, most companies are going to report it, just because of the the nature of our society now, right? um if they can get away with not reporting it, they're probably going to not report it, that or report it after the fact where they dealt with it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We are nearing the end of the hour, so if there are any more questions, please, um, oh, one more question. When you accept terms and conditions for a good or service, is it standard for a company to include language that precludes them from being sued for data theft from cyber attacks?
Yes. And usually some companies provide some type of service uh on hand to mitigate what possibly mitigate any negative repercussions that their customers have. So for example, their identity theft software, right? So some or services, should I say? Sometimes they'll provide that for their customers as compensation for the cyber attack. Um, and so yeah, usually it's they have clauses in there saying like, hey, you understand that there's there's a possibility.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And we are at almost the end of the hour. If you have any more questions, please get them in quickly. There are many thanks to you, Chris, for your presentation, for giving such a deep topic, to be able to talk about it so clearly to people so the non-techies can understand it. And one last question, is using a VPN when traveling advisable?
Yes. It's not complete safeguard, but yes, it is. Um, one of the easiest things to do is to pretend like I'm hotel Wi-Fi, right? Like, I can set that up in 30 minutes, and I pretend like on hotel Wi-Fi, you use the internet normally, and I've just captured everything that you're doing on the internet, right? Like, so it's actually, if you go to a cafe in you, not even just travel, right? Like, if you leave a protected network, like many of you guys maybe at schools that have protected networks in some form or fashion, you probably need to use a VPN.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of the hour. I thank everyone for attending this session. And I think this will be the start of many. So thank you, Chris. Thank
No,
you
no
very
problem.
much.
Thank
Thank you
you
all
for
for
having me.
attending the presentation. We can stay. Oh, they're dropping.